This is Unfuck the Poor. I'm Joe Love, and I should not have read the comments. I have a complex now, but thank you. This is episode 4 of Antifa Inc. Skinheads, Neo-Nazis versus Anti-Racists. And in the last episode, I mentioned that William Luther Pierce was the most influential or most consequential member of Rockwell's American Nazi Party to come out of the Arlington headquarters. And so this episode starts with William Pierce. William Luther Pierce, the radical physics professor who was unable to ram through a crowd of 1,000 wildcat strikers while he was working at Pratt & Whitney, remained in the American Nazi Party as a top official, but he was not technically a leader. He was still in charge of propaganda and sometimes attracted university students who in turn invited him to their campus to speak. In 1970, Pierce appeared in Scranton, Pennsylvania, where he told an audience of about 450 college students that Nixon should be, quote, dragged out of his office and shot. Pierce and party member Joseph Tomasi formed an offshoot for white college students called the National Socialist Liberation Front, which future Nazi David Duke joined in 1970. Duke was in high school when Rockwell was assassinated and broke down in tears upon hearing the news of his death. Duke called Rockwell, quote, the greatest American who ever lived, end quote. Back to William Pierce. Writing under the pen name Andrew MacDonald in 1978, William Pierce released a novel that would become the white supremacist Bible and handbook, The Turner Diaries. I will give you the quickest, cheapest summary of the Turner Diaries as I can. Earl Turner, a lowly member of the white nationalist movement, The Organization, is captured by the Jewish system during the Jewish takeover of the United States. In the novel, every single Jew and person of color is murdered, and Turner flies a plane laden with nuclear warheads into the Pentagon, ending Jewish rule in the United States and eventually the world. I will not critique Pierce's abilities as a writer. He was a physicist and electrical engineer. The man cannot weave a complex narrative, compose an interesting sentence, or even create distinguishing voices. The protagonist is essentially a carbon copy of Pierce himself, plopped down in a fictional world where he can unleash his grimmest fantasies on non-whites. The real problem with the Turner Diaries comes down to its place in modern white supremacy. I do not find this book particularly offensive or grotesque. It is, but I have heard people say worse things about minorities than Pierce writes in this book, and I have seen more gruesome scenes of death in person than what Pierce can imagine. I'm fine, by the way. Pierce does not write at an elevated level. If I had to guess, it's like 6th grade at best. Pierce, however, was objectively smart. Even for the most rabid white supremacist, having the Turner Diaries on your shelf is not exactly something to be proud of. It's a testament to being a drooling, smooth-brained bore. As the novel goes on, it's pretty evident that Pierce envisions himself occupying the upper echelons of white supremacy, overseeing logistics and ideology with a cold, calculating focus. But Pierce needs bullet sponges and sacrificial lambs, and that's his audience for the Turner Diaries. As has been my fundamental roadblock to understanding white supremacy since I was a child, the Turner Diaries doesn't explain what precisely the argument is for white people being the superior race. Pierce depicts black Americans as cannibals and rapists, and Jews as opportunistic schemers and cowards. Pierce's audience has determined prior to picking up this book that whites are superior, and as a fantasy world, the Turner Diaries exploits that belief but never explains it. Pierce also gives explicit permission for whites to target other whites who are race traitors and justifies the slaughters of millions of sacrificial whites as being for the overall benefit of the white race. Earl Turner, the protagonist, is that sacrificial lamb. Turner is the Aryan everyman. Turner is the reader who wants to envision himself the hero. Even when Turner betrays the white race, he is given an exception. He is allowed to complete a suicide mission, and he gratefully accepts it. Pierce wants the audience to believe that Turner's death at the end of the book is significant. Hell, he's a martyr, one of the revered founders of the New World who sacrificed himself for the betterment of the white race for the next 1,000 years. The problem is that for the entire novel, Turner's life as a member of the organization has been one hardship after another. He's on the run, he's starving, he's tortured, his girlfriend is murdered, he becomes a suicide bomber. He never actually gets to enjoy the idyllic Aryan nation he's fighting for. He lives in complete squalor the entire time. In fact, he lives in squalor because his people make the world unlivable. And some white people really fall for this shit. The white power movement does not see you as a precious member. It sees you as a future corpse. Meanwhile, people like Pierce take the place of these supposed Jewish string pullers, commanding soldiers to their deaths. In the white supremacy mythos, it's better to be a cloud of red vapor in the race wars than it is to live in an integrated society. As a fairy tale, the Turner Diaries hits literally every single characteristic of Umberto Eco's eternal fascism. The cult of tradition. Though Turner doesn't say what specific tradition the organization is modeling, they celebrate Hitler's birthday, so we might be able to guess. He does make it a point to highlight modesty, honor, and gender roles, conservative heteronormacy. Rejection of modernism. Turner laments constantly that the modern age of liberalism has made whores of white women and turned men into cucks. Action for action's sake. Turner never displays any hint of hesitation, and he never lingers on any negative feelings he has when it comes time to sacrifice other whites. The Day of the Rope, essentially a scheduled genocide, leaves no room for critical thought. Disagreement is treason. A very large portion of Pierce's worldview is that race traitors have relinquished their humanity. They are sacrificial. There is also no room for compromise or half measures. Fear of difference. Nearly every single interaction with a minority in the Turner Diaries results in rape or murder. Appeal to frustrated middle classes. Turner notes that whites are slaves, that they may be unhappy and want change, but they are too attached to material comforts, food, paychecks, television, and speedboats to do anything about it. Obsession with a plot. Turner explains how the organization and the system both infiltrate the other group, how the Jewish overlords turn blacks against whites, and the government never has any specific leaders. It's just an oppressive specter with tentacles tearing away our liberties. The enemy is both strong and weak. Every minority encountered in the book is murdered. They can't defend themselves. At the same time, they have the entire military on their side. They have nuclear weapons, and Turner is in constant danger of being caught. He is, in fact, caught and tortured. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. Right away, the organization makes clear that you either fight or you are executed. Contempt for the weak. This is one of Pierce's more insidious plot details, one that reveals a self-hatred that emanates from white supremacy. Turner blames white people for being in the position of being beyond saving. They have lived among other races and succumbed to integration. They have invited suffering at the hands of their superior white brothers. Everybody is educated to become a hero. Yep, every white person is ready to be martyred. Machismo and weaponry. A large part of the Turner Diaries has to do with gun caches, ordnance, and the constant readiness to shoot to kill. It also happens that Earl Turner is sexually frustrated being away from his girlfriend for so long. Selective populism. Literally just pure white people, pure minds, pure blood. Newspeak. Again, impoverished vocabulary and elementary syntax. The book is a quick, uncomplicated read. The Turner Diaries is fascist suicide propaganda. Pierce meant for it to be a blueprint for a neo-Nazi uprising, but what it inspired has been a string of lone wolf attacks. Rockwell's movement may not have gained the global momentum he dreamed of during his lifetime, but his legacy paved the way for modern fascists who toned down the blatant Nazi imagery while still praising Hitler. 2017's Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, was a continuation of Rockwell's efforts to build a unified coalition of bigots. I think this is something the news media fundamentally misunderstands about the Charlottesville rally. This was not a congregation of Trump supporters and Republicans, but a networking and organizing event for alt-right groups meant to form a mutual bond and project legitimacy. Matthew Heimbach, the 34-year-old founder of the Traditionalist Worker Party and the National Socialist Movement, wrote on Russian social media website vk.com in 2018, quote, "The mission of the NSM over the next 12 months is to continue this exciting leap forward for National Socialism in America and fulfill the dream of Commander Rockwell," end quote. They kind of just came right out and said it. Richard Spencer, the 47-year-old neo-Nazi who became famous for being punched in the face because he sucks, and who said that Haitians should have been enslaved in the aftermath of 2017's Hurricane Harvey, in addition to claiming he coined the term alt-right, engaging crowds in Nazi salutes and vaguely Nazi-like chants, he was also a featured speaker at the 2017 Unite the Right rally, subsequently arrested for inciting violence, and then chose to represent himself in court and then begged for donations for a lawyer. Just a reminder, this is the same rally where frat fascists chanted "Jews will not replace us," and where Heather Hyde was killed by piece of shit James Fields, who is serving a life sentence for Hyde's death. Matthew Heimbach was also at that rally. Richard Spencer has said that he admires Rockwell's showmanship and use of shock value to bring media attention to the American Nazi Party. Typically, wherever you see a Nazi flag flown today, there is, in its shadow, Rockwell, whose writings and flair for publicity not only encourage but provide a roadmap for a new era of extremists. Whenever someone chants white power or Jews will not replace us, or whenever Nick Fuentes says,
"You think Hitler was very fucking cool?"
Yes, I do.
One of them.
And I'm tired of pretending he's not.
It is the continuation of Rockwell's own voice that refuses to die. Fascist suicide propaganda. And that is what Pierce, Rockwell, and the entire white supremacy, white power, neo-Nazi, and Groyper movements have in common. They fantasize about mass violence, the destruction of everything, and the rebuilding of something new and superior in its place. Off my soapbox. The Turner Diaries has made an appearance in a number of uniquely American horrors. 5 years after its initial publication, the far-right militia group CSA, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, used the Turner Diaries as inspiration behind their plot to bomb the Alfred Murrah Federal Building with a rigged truck, but they were not successful. 12 years later, Timothy McVeigh did complete this mission, and at his home was a copy of the Turner Diaries with this line highlighted, quote, "But the real value of all our attacks today lies in the psychological impact, not in the immediate casualties," end quote. The Turner Diaries inspired real-life neo-Nazi groups, the Order and the Aryan Republican armies, to rob banks, counterfeit money, and attempt to incite race wars in the U.S. The Order was responsible for the assassination of Jewish radio host Alan Berg in 1984. Aryan's People Republic was formed by Chevy Kehoe, who eventually went on a shooting spree in 1997 and died in a police shootout. National Socialist Underground, a German neo-Nazi group, was inspired by the German translation of the Turner Diaries. Larry Shoemake went on a shooting spree in Jackson, Mississippi. Shoemake's wife said the Turner Diaries turned him into a different person. James Byrd, a black man from Jasper, Texas, was dragged behind a truck to his death in 1998. According to a witness, Byrd's murderer said, quote, "We're going to start the Turner Diaries early." British neo-Nazi David Copeland quoted the Turner Diaries during a police interview after killing 3 people with bombs in London's black and gay communities. Jacob Robita, whose home had a copy of the Turner Diaries along with Nazi literature, attacked a gay bar in 2006, killed an ex-girlfriend, then committed suicide. Paul Evans attempted to bomb an abortion clinic in 2006. He had the Turner Diaries at home. Swedish serial killer Peter Mangs targeted immigrants, inspired by the Turner Diaries. Alexander Kropsev stabbed 8 people in Moscow's Bolshaya Brannaya synagogue, Turner Diaries. Pavlo Lapshin, 2013, racially motivated murder in Great Britain, Turner Diaries. Glenn Fraser Miller murdered 3 people at Overland Park Jewish Community Center, Turner Diaries. We actually returned to Glenn Fraser Miller and he doesn't go away. Zach Davies' attempted murder of a Sikh man in Wales in 2015, Turner Diaries. Of course, it would be criminally short-sighted of me to suggest that the Turner Diaries and neo-Nazi magazines form the bulk of modern far-right parasitic supremacy. Rockwell drew from a deep well of racist and debunked conspiracy theories which remain circulated and repackaged today. The main point that I'm trying to make with the Turner Diaries, William Pierce, and Rockwell is that we have a very clear through line from Rockwell, the sexually frustrated young Navy pilot, becoming radicalized listening to Gerald L.K. Smith and Francis Yockey and reading Mein Kampf in 1951, to hate crimes 70 years later with 200 dead bodies between. It would also be criminally reckless of me to suggest that Rockwell's American Nazi Party was the only white supremacist anti-Semitic far-right organization operating in the U.S. in the mid-20th century. Recall that one of Rockwell's ongoing goals was to form a coalition of radical right-wing and far-right groups, presumably so that he could be in charge of all of them. Rockwell's hatred of Jews was so intense that for a while he aligned with the Nation of Islam. This is not the only time that neo-Nazis will align themselves with the Nation of Islam, but I digress. Rockwell's assassination made him a martyr, and in his absence, the neo-Nazi movement saw considerable growth throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. One of Rockwell's contemporaries, William Potter Gale, attempted to merge his organization, the Christian Defense League, with Rockwell's American Nazi Party in 1964. Gale was an associate of Gerald L.K. Smith, and to give you insight into how big of a piece of shit Rockwell was, Rockwell would later identify Gale as a member of a group of former military officers plotting to overthrow the government. Gale would eventually relocate to Glendale, California, and form the white supremacist organization Identity Group, which operated under the Ministry of Christ Church, which advocated for, quote, violence against Fed officers, blacks, and Jewish elements, advocates tax rebellion, and killing Fed judges, FBI, and IRS agents, end quote. Another contemporary of Rockwell was Henry Lamont Beach. Beach was a former member of Dudley Pelley's pre-World War II Nazi Silver Shirt movement. In 1969, Beach formed the Sheriff's Posse Comitatus in Portland and North Powder, Oregon. Posse Comitatus is one of those things that reframes a believer's perspective to such a degree that they cease to speak the language of shared reality. Posse Comitatus believes that the only true legal authority in the United States comes from the county sheriff, and this is closely associated with the sovereign citizen movement, which uses all sorts of wild legal theories to demonstrate a sort of libertarian independence from the state. None of it is actually real. Posse Comitatus was an offshoot of the Portland division of Gale's Identity Group, sharing all the same beliefs towards blacks, Jews, the FBI, IRS, and judges. There is a chicken and egg issue with Posse Comitatus and Gale's Identity Group, but I think a succinct way of explaining it is this. In 1982, Colorado police arrested 8 posse members plotting to kill a federal judge and bomb Denver's IRS office. In February 1983, a North Dakota Posse Comitatus member murdered a U.S. Marshal, fled to Arkansas, and killed a sheriff. And in 1991, member James Wickstrom was convicted for circulating counterfeit money among the members of the Aryan nations, which is actually pulled straight out of the Turner Diaries. In the long run, it doesn't matter who formed what or when. What matters is that the movement Rockwell started just keeps shifting and mutating throughout the 70s and 80s, and 90s and 2000s. But the foundational beliefs do not change. And in fact, Rockwell's part in the movement was a continuation of much earlier supremacist movements. Rockwell did not succeed in uniting all the white supremacist organizations in his lifetime, but he is the connective tissue between pre- and post-war white supremacist movements. Rockwell's overt fascism and willingness to publicly cosplay as a Nazi broke a fundamental taboo in the States that modern figures still capitalize on. The shock value of displaying one's hatred gets media attention, and media attention inherently implies some sort of legitimacy. The showmanship is part of the game. Rockwell used that attention to articulate a message of hate, not only through shouting matches and picket signs, but through a bombardment of propaganda and pseudo-intellectual discourse meant to sow suspicion against non-whites and the status quo. Rockwell was at once an outspoken racist and a master of subtlety to introduce extreme ideas. Rockwell is the original "I'm just asking questions" guy, using the cover of intellectual curiosity to introduce an ideology that uses race as a pretext for explaining perceived injustices. Extremist beliefs, combined with shocking visuals, create a polarizing narrative that attracts those looking for purpose and meaning. If agreeing with even a small portion of extremist ideology is just as bad as believing the whole thing, there's really no place for you in the mainstream. It's safer to embrace the entire culture of hate and supremacy, where belief is the only barrier to acceptance. Who finds purpose and meaning in hate? Who hears the call of fascism, Nazism, white supremacy, or anti-Semitism and says, yeah, that's the place for me? Even for the most entrenched believers, the starting point is always an insecurity or vulnerability, a feeling that things aren't quite right, and a desire to do something about it. Because fascism and supremacy are inherently based on social and racial hierarchies, it should be no surprise that Rockwell's high-mindedness is not a prerequisite to hate. At the top of fascist movements are the philosophical idealists, and below them are the foot soldiers, the members who show up in the streets and online to act upon those ideas. Foot soldiers don't read Hitler or Pierce or Rockwell. They just embody hate through violent action. As U.S. white supremacist and neo-Nazi factions break off and grow throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, they will begin running into an unanticipated opposition equally willing to counter hate through violent action. These fascist groups will claim decentralized independence, but the neo-Nazi movement is funded and coordinated by professional hate groups. Like their counterparts, the first U.S. anti-fascist groups don't read history or theory. They have no idea that their experience in the Midwest and Northwest is nearly identical to experiences in Europe and the UK at the same time. Unlike the fascists, the U.S. anti-fascist movement is purely independent and totally decentralized, their motto being, "We go where they go." And their driving principle is about as simple as you can get. In the words of Mike Crenshaw, one of the first men to popularize punching Nazis, quote, "We felt a moral obligation to meet violence with violence."
Ren, I've got a surprise for you.
Crete, Mauritania, then Transylvania, Monaco, Liechtenstein, Malta, and Palestine, Fiji, Australia, Sudan.
Stupid sexy Flanders!
The year was 1995. I was 10 years old. I shaved my head, wore heavy metal shirts, and wore work boots, even though I didn't work. I listened to Alice in Chains. I tried listening to punk, but it was too loud. And if you asked me if I was trying to be a skinhead, a punk, or whatever, I wouldn't have known what to tell you. I was after a look, a feeling, a sense of identity, while feeling unsure about who I was supposed to be. We were middle class, not working class, but we were still poor, albeit with a safety net in the form of my grandparents. My oldest brother at the time was into grunge. My middle brother liked Garth Brooks. And for some reason, I read nonstop about World War II and Nazi Germany. Specifically Hitler and the Holocaust. My obsession at the time did not foster a hatred towards Jews. I struggled to understand even the most basic elements of anti-Semitism. My failure to understand has not improved. Now, around this time, shaved head, Alice in Chains t-shirt, I recall watching Louis Farrakhan give a speech on television. I do remember that he made anti-Semitic remarks, but I also remember that he explicitly called out non-Jewish whites for their default racism. I was 10. I took it personally. I was hurt. I wanted to tell Farrakhan, I don't hate you. I was a kid. I did not have a message more complicated than that. Maybe I was angry about it, maybe self-conscious, but I do remember thinking I didn't want to grow up being the person who proved Farrakhan right. I'm a people pleaser, so the need to have Louis Farrakhan not hate me, specifically a 10-year-old white kid who would never meet him, was an outsized obsession for me for a while. This was also about the same time that Jerry Springer regularly platformed members of the KKK and neo-Nazi groups in an attempt to revive the hate ratings of 1980s talk shows. I don't know that you should ever give a Nazi room to speak, but Springer sure did. A lot. I hated listening to them, but I always watched because I still wanted to understand why. And when I realized I might never know why, I just wanted to punch them all. If I had lived in a city, had more friends, knew where to go, were cooler and not sitting in the library reading about Nazis, maybe I would have been a punk. If I were a German kid in the 1930s forced to join the Hitler Youth, maybe I would have been one of the Edelweiss pirates who defected and took pride in beating up Hitler Youth, sabotaging Nazi vehicles, and aiding Allied forces. If I wasn't afraid of the world, maybe I would speak out against racism and white supremacy. Maybe one day I wouldn't be afraid of the world. But this was the American South in 1995. I heard the N-word all the time. Dismissive, under-the-breath comments, racist jokes. I was at the age where personalities are developing, beliefs are being forged, and kids are seeking identity. The same conditions are exploited by extremist groups to recruit new members. They offer an existing and elevated identity. They come with their own language and self-curated philosophy. They offer a much larger group that says not only do you belong, but you are a necessary component of their mission. I say maybe I would have been a punk or distributed anti-Nazi literature because looking at my upbringing and surroundings, I wasn't radicalized by anti-fascist propaganda. I was radicalized against white supremacy by white supremacy. If the Turner Diaries provided a white supremacist's fantasy and framework for race wars, Siege, the collected writings of James Mason, inspired a new era of neo-Nazi organizing and action. Advocating for acts of lone wolf terrorism and violence, Mason's writings went mostly unnoticed until they were published as a single collection by former Rockwell disciple Joseph Tomasi in 1992. However, someone taking early notice of Mason's periodicals in the early to mid-1980s was Tom Metzger, who had been a member of the KKK, then led by David Duke, who, if you'll recall, cried when Rockwell was assassinated. Tom Metzger eventually became the Grand Dragon of California. Metzger increasingly leaned towards violence and eventually split off from Duke's KKK, forming the California Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, which engaged in overt public violence. By 1982, Metzger quit the Klan entirely to form the White American Political Association, attempting to sanitize his organization for a political run. Are we noticing a theme? A year after he failed to win election, he rebranded as the White Aryan Resistance. War. In 1979, at the same time that Metzger was growing the California Knights, Greg Withrow, an 18-year-old student at American River College in Sacramento, began passing out propaganda on his campus for his newly formed White Student Union, which drew public criticism. Metzger, then 41, reached out to 18-year-old Withrow, believing that the two men could build a movement of young neo-Nazis. Withrow, who had joined the KKK at 14 and went around beating up minorities as an adolescent, joined Metzger's California Knights, but Withrow saw middle-aged men in sheets as boring and ineffective. Metzger agreed, and he and Withrow transformed the White Student Union into the Aryan Youth Movement, an offshoot of the White Aryan Resistance that tailored its messaging specifically towards angry, violent, racist, working-class youth and young adults. At this same exact time that all of this is happening, late 1970s, early 1980s, a new music genre is coming out of London's East End. Oi is a sound that is simpler than 1970s punk. Now, this subgenre rejected the image of its punk predecessors and really leaned into the football hooligan working class aesthetic. They favored plain clothes, buzzed or shaved heads, and work boots. They look like the kind of guys who hit a bar after working a 12-hour shift. They shaved their heads because it was different. And when you get in a fight, there's nothing to grab onto, and because it's intimidating. It becomes a sort of uniform you can wear everywhere. Oi, as a genre, arose because old punk had become too commercial and, in some opinions, too intellectualized or artistic. For these new punks, lyrics centered on working class themes: police harassment, unemployment, anti-government, drinking, and sex. New punk genres made their way to the US, where they were embraced by a disaffected youth of the working class in cities like Detroit, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Portland, and Seattle, as well as much larger cities like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Unfortunately, racism also makes up part of the working class, and the new punk movement saw the rise of hate punk and neo-Nazi punk. Skinhead culture came out of this new punk era, though skinhead and neo-Nazi are not interchangeable terms. Tom Metzger and Greg Withrow exploited the music scene to recruit the more violent and racist skinheads, appealing to their antisocial and rebellious natures and encouraging more violence under the pretext of protecting the working class and standing up to authority. Metzger fostered their predilection towards hate through the Aryan Youth Movement with cable access shows and newsletters. Not only did Metzger recruit new skinheads, but like Rockwell before him, he attempted to align the Aryan Youth Movement with other neo-Nazi skinhead groups, like San Francisco's American Front and Portland's East Side White Pride. In the early 1980s, with his fledgling crew of neo-Nazi skinheads taking shape, Metzger put on a roadshow of sorts, making appearances on daytime talk shows like Oprah, Geraldo Rivera, and Phil Donahue. Geraldo famously got his nose broken on air by a neo-Nazi guest. Yet another reason you don't give them a platform. What television producers may have seen as exposing a dark corner of American youth subculture was misinterpreted by many active punks as legitimacy. There was a direct correlation between seeing neo-Nazis on daytime talk shows and then seeing them show up at punk shows. By giving them airtime, daytime talk shows introduced an obscure subculture to millions of Americans and inspired the rise of independent neo-Nazi groups across the country. This isn't just me speculating. Many neo-Nazi and white power skinheads explicitly said that because they saw it on television, they thought it was okay. Again, never platform a fucking Nazi. And at the same time, 1979, Greensboro, North Carolina, a deadly clash between the Klan, neo-Nazis, and an activist group called the Communist Worker Party is about to kick off. Originally, the Workers' Viewpoint Organization, WVO, they formed in response to the Vietnam War in the early 1970s. The party was responsible for organizing labor within the textile and healthcare industries and saw a unified, multiracial group of workers as a necessity for achieving workers' progress. They were anti-sexist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist. They were anti-fascist. They were Antifa. Now, I'm going to use some phrases that you probably hear a lot on right-wing media, and you know what? It's important because this is what it actually really looks like in real life when these groups do stuff. The WVO was composed of more militant Marxist radicals and Black liberation members. They advocated direct action by actually getting jobs in target industries with the intention of forming workers' unions. Black workers especially benefited from WVO involvement, having been banned from textile work and only later allowed jobs thanks to the Equal Employment Opportunities Act of 1972. The integration of blacks into these workspaces spurred protests by the National Socialist Party of America, which was an offshoot of Rockwell's American Nazi Party, and the local KKK. And those protests were countered by the more militant WVO. By 1979, the WVO had changed names to the Communist Workers' Party, and clashes with the neo-Nazis and KKK had been just ongoing. Wherever one group demonstrated, the other countered. In July 1979, the CWP interrupted a screening of The Birth of a Nation, a racist KKK indoctrination film hosted by the Klan. A few months later, October 1979, the CWP planned a Death to the Klan march, starting at Morningside Homes, a black housing project. Like the march's name, the rhetoric, signs, and leaflets were radically anti-Klan and anti-Nazi. One flyer read that every Klan member, quote, should be physically beaten and chased out of town. This is the only language they understand. Armed self-defense is the only defense. So that's what it looks like when radical Marxists and Black Liberation Front folks actually get out and do stuff. All this stuff that you see on the news with the protests, the radical Marxist purple hair, no. News stations sent cameras to the October March where upwards of 40 Klansmen and neo-Nazis descended on Morningside Homes. Conflict was near instantaneous. Protesters yelled at each other, CWP members struck Klan cars with their pickets, and then Klan member Mark Scherer fired a shot from his pistol, another Klansman fired a rifle, Scherer shot some more, another Klansman fought with CWP member James Waller over control of Waller's shotgun. All but 6 Klansmen sped off in their cars, and those left behind continued to shoot at the CWP protesters, ultimately killing 9 and injuring 12 more. Those CWP members who were killed included pediatricians, local labor union presidents, union members, and a student body president. The Greensboro Massacre, as it would come to be known, resulted in a decades-long saga of botched legal proceedings. Investigations revealed direct police and federal agency involvement with the Klan, and then a lot of acquittals. And not until 2020 did the city of Greensboro officially vote on a resolution apologizing for the 1979 massacre. Up until the late 1970s, neo-Nazi groups and the KKK mostly had little to do with each other, with each group being wary of the other. Their crossover was inevitable as resentment for the Civil Rights Act grew during the 1970s and targeted violence against minorities escalated in the 80s. In 1981, Klansmen in Mobile, Alabama lynched 19-year-old Michael Donald in retaliation for a not guilty verdict of a black man who had killed a white police officer. Donald had nothing to do with the trial in any way. He was just walking home from the gas station after buying his sister a pack of cigarettes. In 1982, in New York City, Willie Turks, a black Metro Transit employee, and 2 black friends were attacked by a mob of 15 to 20 white men in Brooklyn. Turks was dragged out of his car and beaten to death in the street. In 1984, 2 members of the neo-Nazi movement The Order, taken straight from the Turner Diaries, assassinated left-wing radio host Alan Berg in his Denver driveway. Berg had recently had an on-air argument with Pete Peters, a member of The Order. In 1985, Philadelphia police would drop an improvised bomb on a home occupied by members of MOVE, a black liberation organization that also focused on animal rights and environmental protection and police brutality. The bombing resulted in the destruction of 61 homes in the Cobb Creek neighborhood, leaving 6 MOVE members and 5 children dead, and turning 251 residents homeless overnight. In 1986, again in New York City, 3 friends, all black, Cedric Sandiford, Timothy Grimes, and Michael Griffith, were attacked by an all-white mob when their car broke down in the white working-class neighborhood of Howard Beach in Queens. Griffith, seriously injured, tried to run away on foot, entering the Belt Parkway, where he was struck and killed by an oncoming car. Sandiford, also attempting to escape, ran to police for help, but was arrested. Remember that fascism and state violence is accelerated during times of economic duress as the in-group seeks to villainize out-groups. Ronald Reagan's presidency, basically the entirety of the 1980s, inflicted severe economic duress on the poor and working class. We entered the 1980s in a recession, and by 1982, unemployment was at 11%. Reagan's Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 cut top income rates by 20% while increasing payroll taxes. And the 1981 Budget Reconciliation Act saw billions of dollars cut from social programs like food stamps, supplemental security income, unemployment insurance, school lunches, school breakfast, WIC nutrition assistance, Medicaid, public housing, Section 8 housing, and block grants for social services, legal services, and community services. Meanwhile, Reagan overturned savings and loans, securities, and banking regulations while cutting budgets for the Securities Exchange Commission and other government regulations, allowed corporate stock buybacks, which was up until then considered market manipulation, relaxed antitrust enforcement that resulted in a boom of mergers and hostile takeovers, enabled union busting, and rolled back environmental and worker safety regulations. The result was a booming stock market and plummeting living conditions for the lower middle classes, working classes, and working poor. Inequality grew. Wages stayed the same. Manufacturing jobs left and never came back. If you were poor or working class in the Reagan era, it felt like the country turned its back on you. And thanks to Reagan's war on drugs and policies like mandatory minimums, habitual offender rules, increasing military involvement in law enforcement activities and DEA expansion, and an explosion in incarceration rates, if you were a kid growing up in a poor or working class family, it felt like the state was actively targeting you. The punk scene was not just a rebellion against the Reagan era, it was a complete inversion of Reagan's city on a hill bullshit. Conservatives, banks, and corporations waged war on the working class and poor with policies seemingly bred of mundane hatred, all while dressed in suits, shoulder pads, and Brill cream while speaking the made-up language of trickle-down theory. From Where We Go, They Go, quote, "The punk scene of the 1980s was a catch-all for every freak. Punks, skinheads, goths, runaways, queer kids, and basically everyone who didn't fit into Reagan's America. For these outcasts, especially in a time before the internet, physical space where they could feel safe and be themselves mattered. Venues, hangouts, and parties were shared by everyone. Early on, this even included Nazis." End quote. In 1986, 16-year-old Mike Crenshaw and 6 friends who'd met through the Minneapolis punk scene and were drawn to the tough working-class look of skinhead culture called their crew the Baldies. And they did what 16-year-olds do. They partied, skateboarded, and went to punk shows. Even though they were skinheads, you could not mistake the Baldies for a white supremacist group. Mike Crenshaw is African American, and fellow founder Gator is Ojibwe. The other founding members were white kids from legitimate working-class backgrounds, but the Baldies made it a point to seek out youth of color for new members. Less than a year after the Baldies organized as their own skinhead punk crew, they started seeing white skinheads at local shows who, when questioned, let it be known that they were white supremacists. Paul Hollis, one of those racist skinheads, formed the White Knights in East St. Paul. And suddenly, there was a crew of neo-Nazi skinheads in the Minneapolis punk scene. While the Baldies had been deliberately multicultural and vocally anti-racist, the rise of the White Knights pushed the crew to adopt a militantly anti-Nazi stance, and the Baldies' mission, where they hadn't had one before other than to party and skate, was to deny the White Knights space. If the White Knights couldn't attend punk shows, couldn't hang out uptown, then they couldn't recruit new members. The phrase, "we go where they go," embodies the mission of actively denying space, denying a platform, denying credibility. In a 1989 interview in Maximum Rock and Roll, a punk zine, Baldies member Kieran explains the situation with the neo-Nazis in the scene and lays out the intricacies of their approach. Quote, "From our experience, the tactic that has worked in Minneapolis is physical confrontation, which is fighting them and kicking the shit out of them. In Minneapolis, the phrase punch a Nazi was not an empty threat. The Baldies and the White Knights regularly engaged in street brawls, but not without warning. They offered skinheads displaying Nazi or white power symbols the chance to drop the racism or receive righteous violence. Similar events were unfolding in punk scenes across the country. Punk scenes like Maximum Rock and Roll, Skinhead Times, Constructive Destruction, and many smaller local or regional zines that were distributed at local punk shows and in record stores provided perspective to other punks. These neo-Nazis are showing up to our shows, here's what we're doing about it. Early editions of Maximum Rock and Roll show there was already a strong ideological core of inclusivity and political awareness in the punk scene, with a careful analysis of what was satirical and what was genuine racism or bigotry. In just the second issue of MRR, there is a back and forth between a reader and an editor about the review of Black Humor's 1982 LP, Love God, Love One Another, which was loaded with songs that on the surface seemed like bigoted noise. Editor Ruth Schwartz responds that the album's liner notes clarify the band is satirizing and exploiting the absurdity of the topics of their songs, and that the cover art, Ronald Reagan holding a cross while standing in front of an American flag with swastikas instead of stars, is, quote, one of the most striking anti-fascist images around. In this same issue, another reader praises MRR for calling out Bad Brains for homophobic lyrics. Another reader thanks MRR for calling out, quote, pissheads giving NBJ singer the old show us your tits vomit at the record release party, continuing, I hate fucking wimps who think that whenever a female is fronting, then it's a sex show, end quote. A 1983 issue of Maximum Rock and Roll has a 2-page spread introducing and familiarizing readers with the emerging Oi and skinhead movements creeping into the punk scene. Part music history and part all-point bulletin, MRR writes, quote, this is not to say that all skins are potential fascists. Many have pulled themselves away from British movement manipulation, and a few are progressive, but the general combination of lack of education, lack of opportunity, exaltation of violence, and apolitical feelings have led to a volatile fuel that propels most to a vicious striking out at anything that appears different from them. End quote. By 1987, racist skinheads are clearly regulars on the punk scene and receiving scorn from punks. In a letter to the editor in MRR, a reader comments on the positive review of the skin band Anti-Heroes, quote, the Anti-Heroes are well known in Atlanta as a racist band, so Anti-Heroes have an album coming out? Boycott and apathy are our best friend, end quote. And in an interview with the Wisconsin-based band Depo Provera, contributor Flunky asks, quote, what do you think of the new skin band in town, the Swasta Jews? To which bassist Pat Wainish responds, quote, those guys got a totally fucked up attitude, end quote. Band member Boo Boo adds that some punks were caught taking down their show flyers, which featured Joseph Mengele and a swastika, and, quote, they took one punch and carved a swastika in his back with a broken beer bottle. The kid had to get 67 stitches, end quote. And that brings us to 1988. By this time, punk zines include regular letters to the editor, album reviews, and editorials that pull focus towards racism, sexism, and fascism. Ads for the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee start popping up, requesting information on neo-Nazi skinheads to add to their Klan database. There is an internal struggle where skinhead punks fight for their own identity against skinhead neo-Nazis. There are political asides and controversial opinions. The punk scene at this time is explicitly anti-racist and anti-fascist, but they are leaning towards more social justice in general, and many columns, even in smaller regional or hyperlocal zines, discuss world events and U.S. politics. In perhaps one of the most prophetic letters to the editor ever written, a concerned punk sounds the alarm about the coming dangers of the KKK and neo-Nazi infiltration of the punk scene. I am going to read the entire letter. Dear punks, I'm writing this letter to all punks out there who haven't been converted to the conformist Nazi skinhead and Nazi punk tendency. Nazi skinheads are a basic pain in the asshole. Most of us know this, although some of us are stuck on this we must tolerate stuff. Well, I can understand tolerating a few assholes, but isolated skinheads are now organizing and being organized into something much more formidable. For instance, a pamphlet recently put out by Skins states, quote, our goal is to create a network of white youth gangs and wolf packs across the nation. The Aryan youth movement salutes the wolf pack for hunting down and causing the death of Negro Michael Griffith and for physically beating with baseball bats Negro Cedric Sandiford and Timothy Grimes in the New York area, end quote. The Aryan Youth Movement, formerly the White Student Union, is a major promoter of racist comics and of white power records. Aryan Youth Movement is the child organization of WAR, White Aryan Resistance, which is a part of the Aryan Nations, a bunch of neo-Nazi groups which has been found responsible for the assassination of liberal DJs, of counterfeiting, and of terrorizing blacks and Jews. In case any of you may think that such groups are small, isolated organizations having nothing to do with most skins, let me inform you that former California Knights of the KKK leader and present head of White Aryan Resistance Tom Metzger is presently putting together a compilation cassette of skinhead groups. You may also be interested in learning that White Noise Records from the UK, the company which gives us Screwdriver and others, is directly controlled by the British National Front, England's Nazi Party. And of course, Romantic Violence, an American skinhead group, is affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan and has taken part in racist demonstrations with them. Romantic Violence and the organization CASH, Chicago Area Skinheads, is financing a tour to the States by Screwdriver. And these scum are trying to recruit us. I quote the Aryan Youth Movement, quote, "We have no limit. We will be glad to have the punk rockers, heavy metalists, skinheads, new wavers, anarchists, and anyone else." This comes at the same time as Richard Miles, a Klan leader, says that he urges white anarchists and other white leftists to join the Klan. If they succeed with enough of our number, the punk subculture will just become a part of the growing neo-Nazi movement, and anyone who doesn't conform will be dealt with in a way that makes your average cop look like a pacifist. I don't know what you will get out of this information. I hope you won't just write it off as alarmism. I'm dead serious. I don't know what's to be done, but I definitely think we should keep tabs on local Nazi organizations. Skinheads aren't the real problem. They're not all Nazis. I'm not anti-skin. I'm anti-Nazi. And report about anything in MRR or some other mag. I think most importantly, we should take these creeps seriously and start discussing what's to be done. Carol Levesque, Montreal, Quebec. Levesque's letter is both well-informed and prophetic. In Volume 7, Issue 3 of Tom Metzger's White Aryan Resistance newsletter, published in 1988, contributor and Odinist Wyatt Kaldenberg writes, quote, "The skinhead movement, or Boots Boys as some call themselves, is sweeping the nation, and it is our greatest inroad into Aryan youth." End quote. The very next issue of War, in 1988, makes neo-Nazi skinheads a prominent issue. It is, in fact, front-page news, with skinheads, Confederate flags, swastikas, and the Ku Klux Klan all converging for Aryan Fest 88. Also in this issue are news updates on skinheads from France and Germany, a call to action for skinhead bands to join a Midwest tour, and a quarter-page ad for skinhead-exclusive publications like American Front, Romantic Violence, Pitbull Boys, and War Skins. And in 1988, Tom Metzger would start assembling his army of white power skinheads, starting with San Francisco-based American Front, which Metzger praised on his Access TV show, phone hotline, and newsletter. When Metzger was made aware of a rising neo-Nazi skinhead group, East Side White Pride, in the Portland punk scene, he reached out to recruit them too. Metzger sent Dave Mazzella, president of Metzger's Aryan Youth Movement, up to Portland to provide East Side White Pride direction. In Metzger's opinion, they weren't deliberate enough, not goal-oriented. Metzger sent a letter ahead of Mazzella's visit saying, "You'll get a feel of how we work when you meet Dave Mazzella." In mid-October 1988, Mazzella brought two more members of the Aryan Youth Movement with him, along with VHS tapes for the Portland neo-Nazis to see Metzger and his crew on stage with Sally Jesse Raphael and Geraldo. They distributed Aryan Youth Movement literature from Mazzella's van, and, according to Mazzella, his first night in Portland, he instigated multiple fights with black and brown kids in the streets. Mazzella's instruction to the East Side crew was simple. See a person of color, yell a slur at them, give them the finger, and when they respond, get out of the car and thrash and bash. This, according to Mazzella, was how Metzger taught him.
And you're stating I taught you how to do these things?
Yes.
Where did I teach you to do these things?
At your house?
At my house. Mm-hmm. How many times were you at my house, Mr. Mazzella?
I've been to your house several times.
Tell me approximately how many.
Quite a few. I used to go every weekend when I lived down there.
Give me a number, a ballpark.
I'd say about 25 times, 30 times.
Isn't the fact that you were at my house 6 to 8 times total in the entire time I ever knew you?
That's not true.
You're under oath.
Mm-hmm.
Remember. What part of my house did I teach you to hurt and kill people.
Your living room?
The living room,
All over your house.
all over my house. I taught you how to kill people.
You didn't
In the
put
bathroom?
You didn't put up a poster and say shoot. You know, you were more subtle about things.
Subtle?
Yeah.
November 12th, 3 weeks after Mazzella first arrived in Portland, Mazzella is still around freeloading off East Side White Pride members. Dave is desperately trying to turn East Side White Pride into an official Aryan youth franchise. His van is full of newsletters, he turns every casual conversation into a diatribe about saving the white race, and he has no money. East Side White Pride is working class. Per Eleanor Langer, author of 100 Little Hitlers, East Side White Pride does not merely adopt the aesthetic of the working class, that is who they are, the men and the women. Boyfriends and girlfriends spend all week apart, working normal manual labor or retail jobs, and they only get the weekend to enjoy each other's company. And Dave Mazzella is still just there. Saturday, November 12, 1988, is a day spent mostly by Dave and East Side White Pride trying to find something to do. Ken Miesky, Kyle Brewster, and Steve Strasser are all trying to find time to spend with their girlfriends. Mazzella is trying to get them to hand out more newsletters and flyers. They go to several parties that night, each time missing their girlfriends. They get progressively more drunk. They get into some low-effort fights. Dave Mazzella is freeloading beer. A group of friends steals a case from a gas station. Eventually, much later that night, Miesky, Brewster, and Strasser all wind up crammed with their 3 girlfriends in a car outside Parkland Apartments near Portland's Laurelhurst Park. They are trying to navigate the narrow middle lane on the 200 block of Southeast 31st Avenue, flanked on both sides by parked cars. They are stopped in front of a car parked in the middle of the street, blocking their way. In the parked car are 3 Ethiopian immigrants, Tilahun Antne, Wadwozen Tesfaye, and Mulugeta Sarah. They had been eating dinner together earlier that night and were unable to find a place to park at Mulugeta's Park Lane apartment. So, they are parked on the street, listening to the radio and talking. Before they realize the parked car is full of Ethiopians, the skinheads are polite. They ask the car to move. Then they see the dark skin. Yelling starts. Antne and Tesfaye yell back. Then the skinheads notice their accents. Now there are racial slurs, and Kyle Brewster tells them to go back to their own country. Mulugeta Sarah gets out of the car to go into his apartment so his friends can drive off. Sarah motions for everyone to calm down. Tilahun Antne had been a resistance fighter during Ethiopia's Red Terror under Mengistu Haile Mariam, during which unknown tens or hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians were executed. So, Antne gets out of the car to fight, followed by Tesfaye. When Mulugeta Sarah sees that his friends have not driven off and are now in a street fight, he turns away from his apartment to help them. Ken Miesky, who had up until that point just been sitting in the car with his girlfriend, Patty, takes a bat from the floorboard and runs up the street. Tesfaye has hidden under a car. Antne runs from the bat-wielding Miesky, gets in his car, and drives away. Miesky finds Sarah in the middle of the road and hits him in the side of the head from behind. He hits him again with the bat. The skinheads kick Sarah as he is balled up on the asphalt, and Sarah dies in the street. The murder of Mulugeta Sarah kicks off a landmark court case against Tom Metzger, his son John, and the white Aryan resistance. Metzger acted as his own attorney and got his ass handed to him by the Southern Poverty Law Center with a $12.5 million judgment that bankrupted his family and the white Aryan resistance. Mazzella testified against Metzger. Miesky got life in prison. In the end, sure, the Nazis got what they deserved. However, the publicity garnered by the Sarah murder case revealed, as Carol Levesque predicted in Maximum Rock and Roll, that the racist faction of skinheads was not isolated to a couple of local punk scenes. They were organized, what some skinheads would call professional racists. And the groups of anti-racist skinheads that had organically appeared throughout the 1980s to combat the neo-Nazis on local turf were too small and too scattered to combat the network of neo-Nazis that spanned from California to Canada to the UK. Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice, SHARP, the Anti-Fascist Front, the Anti-Fascist Skinhead League, the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, and Anti-Racist Action had already popped up on the punk and skinhead scenes prior to Mulugeta Sarah's murder. But Mike Crenshaw, original founder of the Minneapolis Baldies and also founder of the original anti-racist action group, was directly motivated to move to Portland in the wake of Sirah's murder and set up a Portland chapter of anti-racist action. 1989 was the year of organizing and networking for anti-racist action. Skinheads of Chicago, Shock, Sharp, Noble City Boot Boys, punks opposed to racism and Nazis, Porn, Brew City Skins, all independently formed groups of anti-racist and anti-fascist skinheads who had come in contact with each other on the punk scene, traveling to shows, reading about them in zines. They would all eventually coalesce around the anti-racist action idea, forming what would come to be known as the Syndicate, and would later include groups from all across the Midwest: Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and Michigan. But the Syndicate wasn't just for punks or skinheads. It forged associations with community organizations like Portland's Coalition for Human Dignity, activist groups like the Revolutionary Anarchist Bowling League, political groups such as the Trotskyist Revolutionary Workers League, and even a bookstore, Backroom Anarchist Books. By 1994, such a diverse coalition of anti-racist and anti-fascist groups had been built across the Midwest that they were directly responsible for the decline in visibility of Midwestern Ku Klux Klan groups. Members of the coalition organized across the Midwest to disrupt public Klan gatherings and rallies. In October 1994, ARA's inaugural meeting of the Midwest Anti-Fascist Network met in Columbus, Ohio for a 2-day conference featuring 15 workshops and several presenters. Workshops hosted included What to Do When the Klan Comes to Town, Setting Up a Pirate Radio Station, and What is Fascism? A Marxist Analysis. Signe Waller gave a presentation at the conference alongside a screening of a film on the Greensboro Massacre. Waller's husband, James Waller, was murdered by members of the KKK at the Greensboro Massacre in 1979, and he was the local president of the local textile workers union. The 1994 conference was a success, and in 1995 they renamed it the Anti-Racist Action Network. The second annual Conference of Anti-Racists and Anti-Fascists solidified 4 fundamental points of unity that, if you had to say Antifa existed, and if you had to say Antifa had a manifesto, would be distilled thus. 1. We go where they go. Whenever fascists are organizing or active in public, we're there. We don't believe in ignoring them or staying away from them. Never let the Nazis have the streets. 2. Don't rely on the cops or the courts to do our work. This doesn't mean we don't ever go to court, but we must rely on ourselves to protect ourselves and stop the fascists. 3. Non-sectarian defense of other anti-fascists. In ARANet, we have lots of groups and individuals. We don't agree about everything and we have a right to differ openly, but in this movement, an attack on one is an attack on us all. We stand behind each other. 4. ARANet intends to do the hard work necessary to build a broad, strong movement against racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, discrimination against the disabled, the oldest, the youngest, and weakest of our people. We intend to win. For over a decade, the Anti-Racist Action Network will rise and converge to meet the moment wherever the Ku Klux Klan holds rallies. They always show up in numbers too big to ignore, relying on the broad, decentralized network of affinity groups and supportive individuals to build demonstrations and counter protest. But ARANet isn't just a protest organization. The network of ARA supporters provides first aid and self-defense training. They collect and disseminate information and intelligence on Klan activity and even dox Klan members. By refusing to call the police, the ARA firmly positioned itself as an organization with a militaristic bent out of necessity. If you cannot rely on police or law enforcement to physically intervene on your behalf, you must be ready to defend yourself. This aversion to cops and the law extended to their wariness of anti-racist groups that did rely on the criminal justice system for enforcement and support. The Anti-Defamation League and Southern Poverty Law Center, while effective, were positioned as anti-extremist research groups, and the ADL purportedly partnered with police and FBI to keep tabs on the ARA. At the time of ARANet's peak popularity in 1999, the network had a mailing list of 31,000 subscribers, and their ARA newsletter had a regular print run of 75,000 copies. Unfortunately, ARA and its decentralized network do not have a perfectly clean history. But this is the nature of decentralized networks. A group acting independently in New York City has no idea what a group acting in Portland, Oregon is up to. Likewise, individuals in a group are just that, individuals acting on their own. Again, I would be doing a disservice to gloss over this fact and the following truths. Within the leftist community, from anarcho-communists to democratic socialists, there are and have always been militant factions. Hell, that's what the ARA was. During the 1990s, when the ARA was intercepting Klan rallies nearly every week, ARA members regularly carried guns for self-defense, just like Klan members and the cops who stood between them. The FBI files on the ARA from the early 2000s identify ARA protesters armed with baseball bats, extendable batons, chains, pickets, lumber, knives, and guns. Then again, Klan members and neo-Nazis carried the same. And whenever the Klan tried to get together in the 90s, ARA was there armed and in greater numbers. Arguably, the ARA dealt the death blows to the attempted Klan revival of the 90s. Like Tom Metzger's California Nights, the light on the Midwest Klan had already begun to dim. Sheets and burning crosses were kind of an old man thing, boring, and the ARA made it simply not worthwhile to join and congregate as the Klan. In 2011, one of the last FBI files I could find on ARA mentions a potential conflict between Morris Gullett's new recruiting campaign and a meeting at a state park for the Aryan nations in Louisiana and a local ARA chapter. There is no information on whether the meeting took place, but 2 years later, 2013, the ARA changed its name to the Torch Network, and based on political climate and the decline of Klan activity, changed focus to anti-fascist activism. 1 year after that, the Greensboro Massacre is revived after 35 years when Fraser Glenn Miller, mentioned a while back, a neo-Nazi who had been part of the ambush on the Communist Workers' Party march against the Klan but had not been convicted of any crime, shot and killed 3 people at the Overland Park Jewish Community Center. When police arrested him, he was put in the back of a police car where he shouted, "Heil Hitler." None of his victims were Jewish. Fraser Glenn Miller spent his entire adulthood steeped in white supremacy. He was discharged from the military after the Greensboro Massacre for distributing racist propaganda. He spent the 80s forming and recruiting white supremacists and militias. Miller's group, the White Patriot Party, was found to be plotting the assassination of Morris Dees, the Southern Poverty Law Center founder and lawyer responsible for bankrupting Tom Metzger, and an injunction was placed against Miller preventing him from engaging in any paramilitary activity. He made political runs for governor and U.S. Senate, and in 1987, after mailing a declaration of war against the United States, his trailer was raided and C4 explosives, hand grenades, and fully automatic rifles were seized. Miller was openly vile in his anti-Semitism and his racism. Miller is so recent that he was a call-in guest on the David Pakman Show in 2010. Keeping with the theme of sexually frustrated white supremacists, it's worth noting that Miller was at one point arrested for engaging in sex stuff with a black male crossdresser. No judgment, I'm just saying these people are repressed. Miller was also an FBI informant. So why is Miller important? Because when the Anti-Racist Action Network, when the Torch Network, when anti-fascists say we go where they go and we don't call the cops, I mean, how much time and money and manpower was spent surveilling Fraser Glenn Miller, giving him a new identity, watching him go from one white supremacist cause to the next, uncovering a cache of weapons, only for him to wind up still committing a racially motivated mass shooting? It's almost fitting in a dark, fucked up way. The Greensboro Massacre was plagued for decades by the fact that local police, the FBI, and the ATF were all aware that armed Klansmen and neo-Nazis were going to counter-protest against the Communist Workers' Party in 1979, and yet none of those in law enforcement did anything to prevent violence and death. 35 years later, a neo-Nazi from the Greensboro Massacre went on to commit more murders while law enforcement sat on mounds of evidence. No one should be surprised when state inaction begets resentment and sparks a "no one is coming to save us" mentality. ARA's points of unity aren't a manifesto. They aren't some crazed ideology. They're quite a predictable response to a society where violent racists are treated with kid gloves by those who are presumably meant to protect and serve. The tactics of anti-fascists are rooted in that mentality. I am not an ARA historian or scholar. Unfortunately, while this podcast series is about Antifa, there isn't much room for the modern anti-fascist network in this episode. Believe it or not, when Trump talks Antifa, he has no idea these people even exist. In fact, when anyone in the Trump administration talks Antifa, all meaning has become lost. Like fascism in the 40s, communism and radicalism in the 50s and 60s, drug, crime, and domestic extremism in the 80s and 90s, terrorism in the 2000s, the last 15 years of American history have been marked by a war against a pervasive scourge that at once encompasses everything un-American yet evades true meaning. The result, every single time, is a new era of surveillance, police brutality, military engagement, and the overall erosion of civil liberties, thrust onto us when the public is scared and vulnerable, and then becoming enshrined in law. The scourge today is democracy. It took 50 years to get here, but thanks to the tireless efforts of the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, American Enterprise Institute, the Alliance Defending Freedom, America First Legal, the Koch Network, American Legislative Exchange Council, Family Research Council, in combination with many more think tanks and organizations and the inevitable creep of white supremacy into the U.S. bureaucracy, we have achieved the final form of conservatism and the end stage of traditional capitalism. We have arrived at a fascist state. The telltale sign is that being anti-fascist is now illegal. And that's where we go next. This was Unfuck the Poor.